The wheel broke with a crack that echoed across the empty prairie like a gunshot. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the children started crying, soft at first, then louder, the kind of crying that comes from hunger and fear and too many days on the road with no end in sight. The widow climbed down from the wagon seat, her boots hitting the dust with a sound so quiet it felt like surrender. She stood there in the middle of nowhere, staring at the broken wheel, at the horizon that stretched endless and cruel in every direction, and she felt something inside her collapse that had nothing to do with wood or iron. She was alone, truly alone now. Her husband had been dead 3 months. The fever took him fast, left her with 2 children, a wagon full of everything they owned, and a piece of paper that promised land out west, land that felt farther away now than heaven itself. She'd kept moving, because that's what you did. You kept moving, or you died. But the wheel had other plans. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. The wind moved through the tall grass like a whisper, carrying with it the scent of sage and dust, and something lonelier than either. She looked at her children, a boy of 7 and a girl barely 4, and she tried to find words that would make this better. But there were no words left, only the sound of their crying and the weight of her own helplessness pressing down on her chest like stone. That's when she saw him, a cowboy on horseback, sitting perfectly still on the ridge above them. His silhouette was dark against the dying light, his hat pulled low, his shoulders broad and unmoving. He'd been there for a while, she realized. Watching, deciding. She didn't call out at first. Pride kept her quiet, kept her standing there with her chin up even as her heart broke into smaller and smaller pieces. But then the little girl sobbed, a sound so raw and frightened that it cut through everything. And the widow felt something crack inside her that pride couldn't hold together anymore. "Please," she said. Her voice was barely more than a whisper, but it carried. The wind carried it. "Don't leave us here." The cowboy didn't move. For a long moment, she thought he would turn his horse and ride away, become just another shadow, swallowed by the coming dark. Men did that. The world did that. It left you standing in the dust with broken wheels and broken dreams and no way forward. But he didn't ride away. Instead, he nudged his horse down the ridge, slow and careful, like a man approaching something wild that might bolt. His face was hard to read beneath the brim of his hat, lined with sun and wind and years of not smiling. He was maybe 35, maybe older. His clothes were worn but clean, his gun belt sitting low on his hip in the way of men who knew how to use what they carried. He had the look of a drifter, a man with no ties and no reason to stop for strangers on a road that led to nowhere. Yet here he was, stopping. He reined his horse beside the wagon and looked down at the broken wheel, then at the children huddled together in the back, then at the widow herself. His eyes were gray, the color of smoke, the color of storms that passed without dropping rain. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough, like gravel under boots. "How long you been out here?" 2 days since the last town," she said. Her throat was dry. "We were trying to make it to the settlement near Carson Ridge. My husband's brother," she stopped. Shook her head. "He doesn't know we're coming. Doesn't know my husband's gone." The cowboy nodded once, his jaw tight. He dismounted with the easy grace of a man who'd spent more of his life on horseback than on solid ground. He walked to the wagon, crouched down beside the broken wheel, ran his hand over the splintered wood. The wheel wasn't just broken, it was ruined. No patching this. No quick fix. "You got a spare?" he asked, though the flatness in his tone said he already knew the answer. "No," she whispered. He stood, dusted his hands on his pants, and looked west, toward the direction she'd been heading, toward the dream that felt impossible now. The sun was almost gone. In another hour it would be full dark, and the prairie at night was no place for a woman and 2 children with no shelter and no protection. "Nearest town's a day's ride back," he said. "Too far to walk with little ones." She knew that. She'd known at the moment the wheel broke. But hearing him say it out loud made it real in a way that crushed her. She looked at her children, at their thin faces and their frightened eyes, and felt tears burn at the corners of her own eyes. She would not cry. She had cried enough. But her body betrayed her, and one tear slipped free, cutting a clean line through the dust on her cheek. The cowboy saw it. She watched something shift in his face, something small and buried, like pain surfacing for just a second before he pushed it back down. "There's an old ranch about 6 miles north," he said quietly. "Abandoned. Roof still good, walls still standing. It ain't much, but it'll keep you safe tonight." "I can't pay you," she said quickly. "I didn't ask for payment." His words were simple, but they hit her like kindness always did when you'd gone too long without it. Hard and unexpected and almost too much to bear. She nodded, afraid that if she spoke, she'd break completely. The cowboy moved with the efficiency of a man who didn't waste time on talk. He unhitched her horse from the broken wagon, tied his own horse to the back, and lifted the little girl into his arms without asking permission. The girl stiffened at first, then relaxed against his chest, her tiny fingers curling into his shirt. The boy climbed up on the widow's horse, and the widow climbed up behind him, holding him close. They rode in silence as the last light bled from the sky. The prairie stretched out around them, endless and indifferent, a sea of grass that swallowed sound and hope alike. But the cowboy rode steady, and the children stopped crying. And for the first time in days, the widow felt something other than fear. She felt the faint, fragile possibility of survival. The old ranch appeared like a ghost in the darkness, a low building made of weathered wood and stone, its windows empty, its door hanging crooked on rusted hinges. It wasn't much, but it had 4 walls and a roof, and after days of open sky and endless vulnerability, it looked like mercy. The cowboy dismounted, carried the sleeping girl inside, and came back for the boy. The widow followed, her legs shaking from exhaustion and relief. Inside, it smelled of dust and old hay and abandonment, but it was dry and it was shelter. The cowboy lit a small fire in the stone fireplace, then stepped back into the shadows, his face half hidden by flickering light. "Thank you," the widow said. Her voice cracked on the words. He didn't answer, just nodded once, his eyes distant, like he was somewhere else entirely, somewhere painful he couldn't escape. She wanted to ask why he'd stopped, why he'd helped. But the look on his face told her he didn't have an answer he could speak out loud. So she stayed quiet, and in the silence, something unspoken passed between them, an understanding that neither of them was whole, that they were both carrying weight too heavy to name. The fire crackled. The children slept. And outside, the wind moved through the grass like a long, lonely sigh. The cowboy stood by the door, staring out into the night, and the widow wondered what kind of man builds fences around his heart so high that even kindness has to climb to get out. The sound of the hammer woke her before dawn, sharp, rhythmic, relentless. The widow sat up in the dim light, disoriented for a moment, forgetting where she was. Then it came back. The broken wagon, the ride through darkness, the abandoned ranch that had become their shelter. She looked at her children, still sleeping on blankets near the dying fire, their faces peaceful in a way that made her chest ache. They looked so small, so fragile. The hammering continued. Outside, she rose quietly, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and stepped out into the cold morning air. The sky was still more gray than blue, the sun just a promise on the horizon. And there he was, the cowboy who'd saved them, who'd brought them here and then disappeared into the night without a word. He was building a fence. Not fixing something that was already there. Building. Starting from nothing. His shirt was off despite the chill, sweat already gleaming on his back as he drove post after post into the hard ground. His movements were steady, mechanical, like a man trying to outrun something he couldn't name. The muscles in his shoulders and arms worked with the kind of strength that came from years of labor. Rancher strength, the kind earned through survival, not choice. The widow watched him from the doorway, confused. They weren't staying here. This wasn't their land. Why was he building anything at all? He must have sensed her watching, because he stopped, straightened, and turned. His face was unreadable in the half-light, but she could see the exhaustion in his eyes, not the kind that came from one sleepless night, but the kind that had settled in deep and permanent, like dust in the cracks of old wood. "You're awake," he said. His voice was rough, unused to morning conversation. "You didn't sleep," she said. It wasn't a question. He didn't answer. Just turned back to the fence and lifted another post into place. She should have gone back inside. Should have let him work in silence, let him keep whatever distance he needed. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the way he moved, like a man trying to build something outside himself because everything inside was broken. Maybe it was the fact that he was still here at all. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. He paused, the hammer heavy in his hand. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then, without looking at her, he said, "Place like this needs a fence. Keeps things out. Keeps things safe. But we're not staying." "I know." The simplicity of his answer cut through her. He was building something for them that they'd never use, fixing something that wasn't his responsibility, giving time and strength to strangers who'd be gone as soon as they could manage it. It didn't make sense. Unless making sense wasn't the point. Unless he needed to build something, anything, to keep his hands busy and his mind from wandering into places too dark to survive. The widow stepped closer, her bare feet cold in the dust. "What's your name?" He hesitated. "Callum." "Callum," she repeated softly. It was the first real thing he'd given her. "I'm Sarah." He nodded once, then went back to hammering. The sound echoed across the empty prairie, a lonely rhythm that spoke of work and silence and all the things that couldn't be said out loud. Sarah watched him for a while longer, then went inside to tend to her children. But throughout the day, she found herself drawn back to the window, watching him work. He moved like a man possessed, digging post holes, splitting rails, stringing wire with hands that knew exactly what to do. A drifter wouldn't know how to build like this. A drifter wouldn't care. This man had been something else once. A rancher, maybe. Or a homesteader. Someone who'd built a life with his own hands, only to watch it fall apart. By afternoon, the fence was taking shape, a sturdy line of wood and wire that marked off a small yard around the old ranch house. It was good work. Careful work. The kind of work a man did when he still remembered what it meant to protect something. Sarah made a simple meal from the supplies in her wagon, beans and hardtack and water boiled for coffee. When she called him in, Callum hesitated at the door, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to cross the threshold. But the children were staring at him with wide, curious eyes, and something in their innocence seemed to soften the hard edges of whatever he was carrying. He sat at the rough table, his hands folded in his lap, his head bowed. Sarah said a quiet grace, her voice steady even though her heart felt anything but. When she finished, Callum whispered, "Amen," so softly she almost didn't hear it. They ate in silence. The children watched him with a kind of fascination reserved for strangers who'd proven themselves safe. The boy, Thomas, finally worked up the courage to speak. "Are you a cowboy?" he asked. Callum looked at him, and for the first time, something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Was. Long time ago. What are you now?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. Callum's jaw tightened, and Sarah saw the shadow pass across his face, the same shadow she'd seen last night, the one that lived behind his eyes like smoke from a fire that wouldn't go out. "Just passing through," he said finally. But he wasn't passing through. He was building a fence. He was staying when every instinct should have told him to leave. That night, after the children were asleep, Sarah sat by the fire and watched Callum through the open door. He was outside again, sitting on the porch steps, his back against the post he'd set that morning. His saddlebag lay open beside him, and in his hands he held something small, a photograph, she realized. Even from a distance, she could see it was damaged, the edges burned and curled. He stared at it the way a man stares at a gravestone, with grief, with regret, with the kind of longing that has no remedy. Sarah's heart broke a little, watching him. She understood now. This wasn't about her, or her children, or even about the fence. This was about whatever he saw in that photograph. Whoever he'd lost, whatever he'd failed to protect. He was building for them, the ghosts he carried, trying to make right in this place what he couldn't make right in his own past. She didn't go to him, didn't ask. Some wounds were too deep for questions, too raw for comfort. Instead, she sat in the doorway and kept watch, a silent witness to his pain. Eventually, he tucked the photograph back into his saddlebag, his movements slow and reverent, like a man putting away something sacred. He stood, looked out the fence he'd built, and nodded once, a small gesture of acknowledgement, as if to say, "This one stays standing." Then he turned and saw her watching. Their eyes met across the darkness, and in that moment, Sarah understood something profound. They were both running. She from a life that had collapsed. He from a memory that wouldn't let him go. And maybe, just maybe, they'd stopped running long enough to see each other clearly. The first drop of rain hit the roof, like a promise breaking. Then another, and another, until the sound became a rush, a drumming that filled the old ranch house with something it hadn't held in years. The sound of life returning to dry earth. Sarah looked up from the stove where she'd been cooking beans, her breath catching. The children heard it too. Thomas jumped up from a floor where he'd been playing with wooden blocks Callum had carved for him, and little Emma clapped her hands together, her eyes wide with wonder. "Rain!" Thomas shouted, running to the window. It came down in sheets, washing across the prairie in waves of silver. The sky had turned the color of old iron, heavy and full, and the air smelled clean, like sage and wet stone and all the hope that drought had stolen. Sarah moved to the window, beside her son, watching the water pour from the sky, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe easy. Then she heard it, a sound that stopped her heart. Drip, drip, drip. She looked up. Water was coming through the roof in 3 places, falling in steady streams onto the floor. The old wood had finally given up, the years of neglect catching up all at once. Sarah grabbed a tin cup, placed it under one leak, then another, then looked around frantically for something, anything, to catch the third. "Mama, the water's coming in." Emma cried, half delighted, half frightened. Before Sarah could respond, the door burst open and Callum stepped. Inside, soaked through, his hat dripping, his shirt clinging to his chest. He took one look at the leaking roof, muttered something under his breath, and disappeared back outside into the storm. Sarah heard him climbing onto the roof, his boots scraping against wet wood, the sound of him moving, fast despite the rain. She held her breath, terrified he'd slip, that he'd fall, that this man who'd given them so much would break himself trying to fix one more thing that wasn't his responsibility to fix. But he didn't fall. He worked up there in the storm, and slowly, miraculously, the leak stopped. First one, then another, then the third. Sarah stood below with her children, listening to the sound of him hammering, of boards being moved and placed, of a man doing what he knew how to do even when the world was falling down around him. When he finally climbed back down, he was drenched and shaking from cold. Sarah met him at the door with a blanket, her hands trembling as she draped it over his shoulders. He didn't pull away, just stood there, water dripping from his hair, his eyes meeting hers with something raw and unguarded. "You didn't have to," she started. "Yes, I did," he said quietly. And she understood. This wasn't about duty anymore. This was about something deeper, something that scared them both. Thomas brought Callum a cup of hot coffee, and Emma, brave little Emma, who'd been afraid of him at first, reached up and took his hand. She didn't say anything, just held it, her small fingers wrapped around his calloused ones, and looked up at him with complete trust. Something in Callum's face broke. Sarah saw it happen, saw the wall he'd built around himself crack right down the middle. His jaw tightened, his eyes went glassy, and he looked away fast, like he couldn't bear to be seen in that moment of weakness. But Emma didn't let go. She just stood there, holding his hand, anchoring him to the present when everything in him wanted to run back into the past. The rain kept falling. Sarah moved around the small kitchen, finishing the meal while Callum sat by the fire, wrapped in the blanket, Emma curled up beside him. Thomas sat on his other side, asking questions about horses and ranches and what it was like to be a cowboy. And Callum answered, slow and careful, his voice rough with emotion he was trying hard to hide. They ate together as the storm raged outside. The food was simple, beans and cornbread and coffee strong enough to strip paint, but it felt like more than a meal. It felt like family, like home, like something worth protecting. After the children fell asleep, Sarah sat across from Callum at the table. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the room. Outside, the rain had softened to a gentle patter, the kind that would soak into the earth and bring green things back to life. "You should know something," Callum said suddenly. His voice was so quiet she almost didn't hear him. "I wasn't always like this." Sarah stepped through the door before she could stop herself. The marshal's hand was on his gun. Callum stood perfectly still in the yard, his arms loose at his sides, his face empty of everything except resignation. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dirt, and the air felt heavy, like the moment before thunder, before everything breaks loose and changes forever. "Ma'am, you should step back inside," the marshal said. His voice was firm, but not unkind. He was older than she thought, maybe 50, with gray threading through his beard and lines carved deep around his eyes. A man who'd seen too much and still had to keep looking. "No," Sarah said. The word came out steady, stronger than she felt. Callum's head turned sharply toward her. "Sarah, no," she said again, this time to him. She moved down the steps, her bare feet cold against the wood, and positioned herself between the two men. Her heart was hammering, so hard she could feel it in her throat, but she didn't move, didn't look away from the marshal's weathered face. The marshal sighed, the sound of a man tired of complications. "Ma'am, I don't know what this man told you, but he didn't tell me anything," Sarah interrupted. "He didn't have to." "Then you don't know who he is." "I know what he is." She looked back at Callum, at the man who'd stopped when no one else would have, who'd built fences and fixed roofs and carved toys for children who weren't his own. "I know he saved my life, saved my children's lives. I know he's worked himself to the bone for strangers, asking for nothing. That's all I need to know." The marshal studied her for a long moment, his hand still resting on his weapon. Behind her, Sarah could hear Callum's breathing, shallow, controlled, the sound of a man preparing for the worst. "His name's Callum Pierce," the marshal said quietly. 3 years ago, there was a fire on his ranch. His wife and daughter died. Week later, the man who sold him faulty kerosene for his lamps, man who knew it was bad and sold it anyway, turned up dead outside a saloon in Abilene, shot twice in the chest. Sarah felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She looked back at Callum, searching his face for denial, for explanation. But he didn't deny it, just stood there with his jaw tight, and his eyes full of pain so old and deep it had fossilized into something harder than bone. "Did you do it?" she asked. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. Callum met her gaze, and she saw the truth before he spoke it. "Yes." The single word hung in the air between them. Heavy, irrevocable, honest. Sarah felt her chest constrict, felt everything she thought she understood shift into something more complicated. He was a killer. The man who'd been so gentle with her children, who'd built with such careful precision, who'd carried grief like a cross. He'd taken a life. But when she looked at him, she didn't see a murderer. She saw a father who'd lost everything. A husband who'd watched his family burn because someone chose profit over safety. A man who'd carried that weight for 3 years, who'd run not from justice, but from himself, and who'd finally stopped running when he saw another family in need. "The man you killed," Sarah said, turning back to the marshal. "He murdered Callum's family. Maybe not with his own hands, but he did it just the same. That's not for you or me to decide, ma'am. That's for a judge." "Where's your judge?" Sarah's voice rose, anger flooding through her fear. Where was the law when that man sold poison to families? Where was justice when Callum lost his wife and child? "You're telling me the law would have done anything?" The marshal's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, something that looked like recognition, like he'd asked himself the same questions and found no good answers. "The law's the law," he said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Then your law is broken." The words came out hard and clear, and Sarah was as surprised as anyone to hear them. But once they were spoken, she couldn't take them back. Didn't want to, because it was true. The law had failed Callum, had failed his wife and daughter. And if she stepped aside now, if she let this marshal take him, she'd be failing him too. Behind her, Callum spoke. Sarah, don't. This isn't your fight. She turned to face him fully, her eyes burning. You made it my fight when you fixed my wagon wheel. When you brought us here. When you built a fence to keep my children safe. When you, her voice broke, and she had to stop, had to swallow past the lump in her throat. When you gave us hope, when we had none left. Something in Callum's face crumbled. His shoulders sagged, and he looked away, toward the horizon where the sun was climbing higher, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber. I don't deserve that, he said quietly. Maybe not, Sarah said. But you're going to accept it anyway. She turned back to the marshal, her chin lifted, her hands steady despite the fear coursing through her. How long have you been tracking him? 2 years, off and on. He's good at disappearing. Then let him disappear again. Ride back the way you came and tell them you lost the trail. The marshal's jaw tightened. I can't do that. Can't? Or won't? Ma'am, look at what he built. Sarah gestured to the ranch house, to the new fence, to the repaired corral and the fixed roof. Look at what he's done here. He's trying to make things right. Doesn't that count for something? The marshal looked at the property, and Sarah saw him taking it in, the careful workmanship, the attention to detail, the evidence of a man who still knew how to build even after everything had burned down. His hand finally left his gun, and he removed his hat, running his fingers through his gray hair. I have a job to do, he said, but the words sounded hollow now, like he was trying to convince himself more than her. Then do it somewhere else, Sarah said. Please. The word hung between them, simple, desperate, human. The marshal looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw him seeing not just a widow defending an outlaw, but a mother protecting what was left of her world. A woman who'd lost too much already and couldn't bear to lose anything more. The silence stretched long. From inside the house, Sarah heard Emma crying softly, and Thomas trying to comfort her. The sound of children afraid, children who'd already learned that safety was fragile and people left without warning. The marshal put his hat back on, looked at Callum one more time. I came here following a lead, he said slowly. Lead went cold. Happens sometimes out here. Trail just disappears. He mounted his horse, his movements deliberate. I'll be filing my report as such. Sarah's breath left her in a rush. Thank you. The marshal nodded, but his eyes were on Callum. I'm doing this once, Pierce. Once. You understand me? You stay here. You build something good. You become someone different than the man who pulled that trigger. Because if I hear your name again, if you give me any reason to come back, I won't ride away a second time. You won't, Callum said. His voice was raw, stripped of everything except truth. I swear it. The marshal studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. He turned his horse and rode away, dust rising in his wake, growing smaller and smaller until he was just a dark speck against the endless prairie. Sarah stood, watching, until he disappeared completely. Then her legs gave out, and she sat down hard on the steps, her whole body shaking. Callum moved to her side, knelt beside her, his hand hovering near her shoulder, but not quite touching, like he wasn't sure he was allowed. Why did you do that? He asked. Why would you risk? Because someone had to, Sarah said simply. She looked up at him, at this broken man who tried to fix her world. Because you stayed when you could have left. Because my children are alive because of you. Because, she stopped, searching for the right words, finding only the truth. Because I think maybe we're supposed to save each other. Callum's eyes glistened. He sat down beside her on the steps, and for a long time they just sat there in silence, watching the sun climb higher, feeling the weight of what had almost happened settle into something else, something that felt almost like gratitude, almost like grace. Inside, the children had stopped crying. Through the window, Sarah could see Thomas holding Emma's hand, both of them watching the two adults on the porch with expressions too old for their young faces. What happens now? Callum asked quietly. Sarah looked at the ranch house, at the home he'd built, at the fence that marked their small piece of safety in a world too big and too cruel. She looked at her children, at the man beside her, at the life they'd somehow stumbled into building together. "Now," she said softly, "now we stay." And in the silence that followed, in the space between running and standing still, they found something neither of them had been looking for, but both of them desperately needed: a place to begin again.